Welcome to This Old Democracy, a regular podcast where we explore the ideas, movements, and people who are working to rescue our faltering political system and rebuild American democracy on a stronger, more inclusive, and truly representative foundation. I'm your host, Micah Sifry, and I've been on this beat for a long time, from taking on the problem of money in politics, to writing a book about third parties, to tracking how the internet keeps shaking things up, and more recently, joining the fight against rising authoritarianism. This podcast is produced in partnership with the Center for Ballot Freedom, a cross-partisan nonprofit dedicated to strengthening democracy. Today, we're talking with Bill Kristol, editor-at-large for the Bulwark and a leading conservative author, who, having previously served in senior positions in the Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush administrations, is now one of Donald Trump's fiercest critics. Welcome to This Old Democracy, Bill.
Good to be with you. How are you?
Holding up. If I start coughing, it's the COVID that I just am getting over, but I'll do my best.
Good. Well, you're playing hurt. That's impressive. You know, it's important. A mere bout of COVID can't stand in the way of saving our democracy, right? So
I don't know. This was a tough one.
I feel. Yeah.
In any event, in the interest of time, I'm not going to ask you to describe how you went from being a Reaganite Republican to a never Trumper. But in the interest of full disclosure, I do want to mention that we've known each other, at least in an incidental way, since 2002, when you were kind enough to contribute an essay to my book, The Iraq War Reader. We were on opposite sides of that debate, and I suppose there may be other political issues today where we disagree, but certainly now and for the last 8 years, we've been on the same side of working to oppose rising authoritarianism in the United States. I should say I read your stuff in the Bulwark regularly, and I think the Bulwark has become essential reading for everyone who cares about democracy in America. And I'm impressed by how you sustain your outrage day after day as we endure a president and an administration that people like you say is freely violating democratic and constitutional norms. So to start out, I wonder if you would give us your big picture view of where we are and how that informs your thinking on how we save the American experiment in democracy, Bill.
We're not in good shape. The second term of Trump's second term has been as bad or even worse than I thought it might be. And I was called an alarmist for being extremely alarmed about what the second term would be. I was alarmed about the first term. That was bad. There were guardrails. The establishment, staffed many of the key positions in his administration and stopped him from doing certain things. He was a little uncertain. The authoritarian movement, this is something you've written about, as a whole, was not as well developed then. So they were sort of making stuff up on the go. He lost in 2020. I had a brief moment of hoping after January 6th that the Republican Party would save itself from Trumpism. That turned out not to be the case. I had 2 or 3 years of hoping the country would not fall back into Trumpist clutches, but that turned out not to be the case, unfortunately, last November. And these 6 months have really been, people should not kid themselves. We're not sort of just beginning down the authoritarian slide. We're somewhat down that slide already, and nothing's inevitable, and slippery slopes can be, made less slippery and reversed and so forth. But on a bunch of issues, it's on deportations, for example, with immigration, on the personalization and consolidation of power in the presidency within the executive branch, and going after independent institutions, universities, businesses, the intimidation of them, the successful intimidation of them in many cases, which is not, it's Trump's fault for trying to intimidate. It's the rest of our fault for going along with that or being intimidated. Anyway, on all these fronts, I think the authoritarian project is further advanced than I would have expected even 6 months ago.
Mm-hmm. So that's the bad news. Do you see mean, how do you conceptually, if you have a theory of change for what gets us back, what holds the line, the Bulwark, after all, is a great name, right? Beyond just trying to hold steady, what's your theory of how we get out of this mess?
I mean, short term, it's pretty standard, I suppose, which is, knock down Trump's popularity, educate people as to what he's doing, educate people to the second and third order effects and implications of what he's doing. They may not be that put off at first if, some internal working of the Justice Department changes, but helping people see where we're going, I think, is very important. That's what we try to do at the Bulwark. And so just defeating Trump electorally, though he'll try to put a thumb on the scale in the elections, stopping him from doing as much damage as he is trying to do in so many ways, hoping and working that maybe the Republicans, few Republicans in Congress will balk at some things, obviously working for a good outcome in the 2026 elections and then 2028. Those are really important. But obviously, some of the elements of Trumpism have been brewing for a while, to say the least. The polarization that preceded Trump and has been accentuated by Trump, this shows the danger of that. I guess I at one point was a little complacent about the partisanship, but when partisanship spills into real polarization and it really starts to cleave the society, then you're a little more ripe for this sort of thing. We in a way suffered through a perfect storm with Trump winning an narrow victory and then being able to winning again and so forth. So the longer term fixes, or at least beginnings of fixes, have to do with all kinds of reforms, policy reforms. And here I may come over more to some of your views, especially on things like income inequality and stuff, and the sort of dangers of a kind of oligarchy in recent years. Some policy reforms, but a lot of procedural reforms too. It turns out we had a lot of guardrails, but a ton of them depended on history or norms or good faith or just kind of honorable behavior. And a lot, they have just crumbled. And so thinking hard about how to reconstruct or construct some of those guardrails is very important, I think.
Yeah, we'll get to that in a second. But just to stay on the situation that we're in, and I'm wondering if things like Trump backing down on the extreme tariffs or his seeming flip-flop on Putin, now he wants to arm Ukraine. I mean, does any of that say to you, this guy can be, he can be shoved back? Or is that just, he has no principles, it doesn't matter, he'll just do whatever it takes to, survive another day politically?
Well, no, it matters because obviously, substantively, it's important what outcomes we have in a place like Ukraine. So even if for bad reasons he accommodates himself to political pressure, or he just doesn't like Putin, that's still a good thing. You can't count on it for lasting for 3.5 years. No, and any kind of defeat for him or forcing him to reverse course is good. I mean, I think he's a good demagogue, an effective demagogue, unfortunately, but he also means he doesn't want to get too far out of sync with public opinion. I think he's a little more susceptible, therefore, to reversing course when the markets don't like it, especially when the markets don't like it. That's his world, his friends, his donors, his buddies at Mar-a-Lago, but also when even the public doesn't like certain things. And so I think that fighting that fight is very, very important, and probing for weaknesses. We're talking here in mid-late July, and the Epstein controversy, or Epstein affair, has broken open, and Trump is engaged in a perfectly obvious cover-up of the files, I believe, for obvious reasons, that he's in them and probably in them in a pretty bad way. And we already know some of what was a fair amount about Trump and Epstein, and also that one document we do have in the files that's pretty damning, in my opinion. So pushing that very hard. My experience in politics in general, but I think especially in this kind of moment, is you don't really know ahead of time what issues are going to blow up or what issues are going to work best. The pollsters love to tell you that, they've polled everyone, and kitchen table issues. Well, of course, people answer that way to a poll, but then they get caught up in something and they lose faith in Trump on something like Epstein. They think they lose faith in his honesty. They lose faith maybe in the people who are working for him. And then they're more open to being persuaded on other issues. So I'm very agnostic in a sense on what might weaken Trump. But I am convinced we need to weaken him. And that's really where I come down.
For sure. I mean, that theory works whatever world we're living in, whether we have free and fair elections or we're dealing with something worse than that. Do you see it in the response you get at the Bulwark? Overall, I mean, we used to have an old joke at the Nation when I worked there, when Reagan was president, that he was, bad for the country but good for the nation, in that our subscriptions, always went up when a Republican was in the White House. Is that happening for the Bulwark? Are you guys seeing? I mean, are you finding that for some people the scales are falling from their eyes and they're coming to you, having sort of lost faith in Trumpism?
Yeah, we have some converts, so to speak, and an awful lot of people just mobilized by the threat. I mean, it's interesting. We did well in the Trump first term. That was really, we launched it in 2019 in a very, very low key and small way, and then really started to take off around the 2020 campaign in 2021. Had a good 3 years of under Biden, actually, somewhat to our surprise. We figured people, as you just said, people wouldn't be that interested, but people were aware of the threats. And obviously Trump was running for the nomination. There was January 6th and the after effects of that, and then Trump running for the nomination. But after Harris lost, after Trump won, we figured people would just be demoralized, and we just were ready for, kind of not gaining subscribers for a while and just doing our job. And instead, we've, I guess, doubled probably in both paid and unpaid subscriptions since.
Well, that's very good.
Since the election. And that tells me, I don't think those are converts, honestly. People hadn't yet had a reason to desert Trump if they had voted for him in November. But I think the sense of alarm among lots of people, including many people who hadn't been that involved before. That's many of our readers. I mean, they were new readers to us, obviously, but they also were kind of newly engaged in politics. And it was sort of like, well, they assumed the Trump thing was a 4-year weird interregnum. They assumed it would go away. It's unfortunate he got the Republican nomination again, but they figured he'd lose and maybe go back to something like normalcy. And, these are not terribly political people in all cases. And then that didn't happen. I think they joined a lot of people who are very political and very engaged and alarmed. And so it's as with you with the nation, we've had we've had good years. We've tried to really take whatever additional resources we've been able to get, and we've been grateful to get, and put them into reporting on a bunch of issues, an immigration newsletter, a healthcare newsletter with Jonathan Cohn, who you probably know, and I think that's been helpful. I mean, I think you do need to. You need to flesh out and have different aspects. You have to explain to people or help people see what's going on. And some people are interested in some things more than another. And some people want to see the whole complex. So we've tried hard to do that. But I'm encouraged. That part you asked me earlier, I think what sort of encouraged me. And I do feel like there's a bit of a, the bad news is we have a very dangerous authoritarian president, and he's only 1/8 of the way through his term. And it's could well get worse before it gets better. It's not like they're going to, there's going to be more deportations in the next 6 months than there have been in the first 6 months. Now, maybe they won't be the most grotesque instances of it to El Salvador and stuff, but, and that's true in a lot of other issue areas as well. So I think it's very foolish. One of the mistakes I think some of our friends in the media have made is they see the situation, they take a photo of it, it's sort of a static snapshot, and they don't think dynamically. And those guys are in there. Trump knows what he wants. Miller and Vaught know what they're doing, unfortunately. And they've got an administration full of total loyalists and people who have no respect for democratic norms or institutional importance of institutions, or even any standing really separate from their loyalty to Trump. So a lot of that's going to get worse, in my opinion. I do think the reaction to it could also check a lot of that, though. His popularity has dropped. I mean, here's the night to get a sense of how things could be worse. What if Trump's approval rating were 58%, not 42 or 43%? But it's not inconceivable, right? It happens. I mean, including with authoritarians, incidentally, they take over and they're temporarily popular. The economy's has held up. So we're not at war. So you could say, in a way, it's a surprise that Trump's approval has gone down. That for me is heartening. It's not like they don't work all 24 hours a day on propaganda and on convincing people that their opponents are terrible people and traitors and stuff. So I think in that respect, there is some democratic resiliency here, I would say.
Yeah. Well, I agree with you about that. And I want to shift now to, something you started to bring up earlier, which had to do with the idea of guardrails and also the extent to which our political system itself is generating the energy, part of the energy that keeps Trump going. You talked about polarization and the degree to which we're in two warring camps, where even if somebody maybe has questions about what Trump is doing, the fallback is, but the Democrats are worse, or and Trump does this all the time. Obviously, that's one of his moves, is to lean on blaming the other side and making up, claiming that he's just the victim of a witch hunt and all of that, and his base seems to eat that up. And so what's interesting to us at the Center for Ballot Freedom is, where you've actually put some time into thinking about this problem of hyperpolarization and what needs to be done to sort of get us out of this self-reinforcing doom loop, as Lee Drutman calls it, the two-party doom loop. I know that you recently served as part of a group of distinguished scholars and advocates and legal minds put together by the American Bar Association that was called the Task Force on American Democracy, which is due to issue its recommendations, I think, in a few months. And you recently co-authored an essay that I think was published in Newsweek with another task force member, Tom Rogers, about at least one proposal that the task force is considering to revive the practice of fusion voting. Could you talk a bit about that? How did you come to that place?
So I think, fusion voting is allowing a candidate to run on more than one ticket, usually just two, but sometimes even more than two, and then his votes get counted together. So you're not taking away from his final chances in the general election. He's helping himself. One reason, so there are many electoral reforms that people have pushed: ranked choice voting, which now exists in New York City and some other places; open primaries. Virginia, we actually do have a non-party registration state, so it's an open primary state. So I, in fact, have requested at different times Republican ballots and Democratic ballots, and there's no problem with doing that. Here, you don't even have to re-register, and so you can try to vote. If the Republicans are all acceptable, as they increasingly are for me these days, it really have been since Trump, because they're almost all Trump acquiescent, even if not Trump, fervent Trumpists. I can go vote a Democratic primary, but it means I could also, when there was some hope of stopping Trump in 2024, and there was no Democratic primary at the time. Biden was unopposed, but basically, and hadn't gotten out yet. I could vote for Nikki Haley just to try to wound Trump a little. So that's one system. But fusion voting is a somewhat different way of trying to address this problem of polarization. I think I'm comfortable with it, or thought a lot about, because I grew up in New York, which has had it forever and has it. I think only two states have it now, New York and Connecticut. Most of the country had it at one point. And then the established parties tried to get rid of it. But Michael Bloomberg, who I think was on the whole a good mayor of New York and did good for the city, would not have won without fusion voting. That is, he never got enough votes on the Republican line to defeat the Democratic nominee. He got votes because he had a couple of cases and independent lines that he set up himself, really, because a lot of people didn't feel comfortable voting for a Republican, but they didn't want a progressive Democrat. They wanted someone who would get the cities, on sound economic footing. And
Bloomberg was basically a Democrat using the Republican label.
But he was able to use the independent label too, thanks to fusion voting. So that's, absolutely. So I think there's a fair amount and the parties have gotten so polarized, and the primaries within the parties are pretty obviously polarizing forces. And so Liz Cheney gets defeated in the Wyoming Republican Party. A few Democrats went to the trouble there, re-registering 60 days ahead of time so they could vote for Cheney in the Republican primary, because they knew a Democrat wouldn't win in Wyoming, but it wasn't enough. Now, if you had fusion voting, you could have someone running as an independent candidate. He or she could also be endorsed by one of the major parties, or it could be a candidate of the major parties that the independent party is supporting, the centrist party is supporting, and it gives a greater chance, I think, for it isn't as much of an ask to go cross the party lines. You can just go to a third party, as it were, an independent party. It's not a solution to everything. It works in some circumstances better than others, but I think it would be helpful in breaking down that two-party doom loop, and and also doing one reform. B, it exists in a couple of states. So all the arguments against it, it's so complicated, it's impossible to do. I don't think they're true. And third, breaking down the doom loop in one or two places could influence doing it in more places, but also influence other efforts. You know what I mean? You need to get
Right.
we need to be in an age of reform. I think you and I would agree on that. We might differ on some of the details of the reforms, but if we're going to be in an age of reform, you have to start getting some reforms implemented. One reform leads to more reforms. If it's and so you can't wait for everything all at once. It's been a little bit of that. I found. I don't know if you found this too in some of our friends and some of the foundations and the donor world. Here's my list of 10 reforms, and if you don't do all 10, nothing is worthwhile. And well, it doesn't work that way in democratic politics often. So you got to take what you can get. I think fusion voting is a pretty easy case to make. Now, the parties don't like it. So going to the courts and saying this is a ballot freedom issue, we should be able to choose to have a candidate run on two parties and have the vote fused at the end, combined at the end, would be a good thing. But I think it's a doable reform that would do some good.
I think that you put it well. The one additional thing I would add is the recognition that politics is a team sport, and that as individuals, voters, I mean, yes, your one vote does matter, but it doesn't matter that much, except in extremely close races. Whereas parties are the things that organize voters around shared values and shared ideas. And then they're the ones who actually build up, recruit, support candidates. Your Mike Bloomberg example is really interesting. The one thing I would sort of ding Bloomberg for not doing is he didn't build an institution around his vision. I mean, he has a foundation. He does many good things in other ways, but in the political arena, once Mike Bloomberg was done being mayor, there was no continuation of that vehicle because it was so personal. It was literally just something that worked for him. Whereas at least the theory around fusion voting, which goes back to how it was practiced in the 1800s, is that it enables parties to form and sustain themselves, and that today Americans are really frustrated that there are only two parties that meaningfully can compete to elect people, and that leaves a lot of people frustrated that they don't have more choices, putting all of the burden on the voter to solve that problem with their one individual vote, rather than enabling institutions that fight on an ongoing basis to have leverage in the process. I think, do you agree with that? Does that make sense to you?
That's well said. And I think I would just add a point just to follow up on what you said, which is I think having a centrist party, and there could be parties that already are some more radical parties, actually. So but they can exist too. But having a centrist party would provide an incentive for the major parties to move to the middle. And that's very important. What are the incentives now if you're a Republican and you're running for the Senate? You want the endorsement of the gun lobby. You want the endorsement of National Right to Life. You want an endorsement of the big business groups. Everything pushes you in the direction of Republican orthodoxy, not to even say kind of extreme conservative positions. What if there's a centrist party that could endorse you, but it could also endorse a moderate Democrat if a moderate Democrat gets the nomination in that party? And that centrist party has 2%, 5%, 10% of the vote. And also it's a kind of label that even if people don't vote there, they kind of signals to them that this is someone they would be comfortable with. Are you going to give up that centrist necessarily to cultivate all the extremes in your own party? So I think it would have an effect on the two major parties. And that's another institutional way, as you're saying, you're not putting the parties themselves would now have incentives to behave more responsibly than they do today.
Yeah. So can't talk about this subject without at least spending a few breaths on Elon Musk's America Party. I mean, he seems to have broken with Trump now over the big ugly bill and maybe also the Epstein stuff. Do you think there's anything to what Musk is doing? He's talking about, I think, running people in a few House or Senate races. What's your take on that?
He could do it. I mean, he's both I don't care for him, and he's but a destructive force in so many ways. But he's not. And
tell us how you really feel, Bill.
Yeah, and there's a lot of bluster and stuff he doesn't follow through on, and maybe that'll be a case of this. On the other hand, he's done a lot of things, and he has followed through on some things. And he did spend $250 million to help Trump. So he could cause trouble in these races, and I'm not against it if he wants to run deficit hawks and against Republican incumbents. Now, I don't think that deficit hawk's likely to win. So then it's a question of, can you encourage voters to, in a way, cast a protest vote there and help elect the Democrat? Maybe they'll do that instead of going to vote for the Democrat. If that happens, that's fine with me in 2026. But I do think, let's put it this way, third parties that are not, the playthings of super wealthy individuals or the product of exasperation or resentment or unhappiness at how you've been treated personally, parties that actually stand for something, especially now in the center, which is so vacated really certainly by the Republicans and Trump. But Democrats are more complicated. There are plenty of centrist Democrats here in Virginia. Abigail Spanberger's the nominee. I think she'll win. I'm for her. If there were a centrist party in fusion voting, maybe get a few extra votes of some Republicans who don't want the radical Republican nominee, but still are kind of uncomfortable with the Democratic label. But so it's not a problem here in Virginia, but it would be better to have more institutional ways of encouraging moderation. And in a way, Musk seems to me to make the point that if you don't have fusion voting, you get a Pat Buchanan third party, a Ralph Nader third party, maybe an Elon Musk third party. You don't get a third party that's here to stay and that plays a constructive role in the political system.
Well, those of us who are advocating for bringing back fusion might theorize that if Musk plays out this particular card and does spoil in a few places, that he may teach the parties a lesson, which is that they actually do need to bring back fusion, or else they're just going to be subject to this kind of wild card danger.
Right.
I'm looking for silver linings.
I
take
think
whatever I can find.
That could be true. It's, at a time when you need change, you can't be super picky about every possible vehicle. There'll be false starts and even towards change and even damaging starts in some ways, but I think again, fusion's existed for a long time in a lot of places. It has existed through the 20th and 21st century, at least in a few places. So I think it's a pretty safe reform, but also one that could really make a difference.
Yeah, appreciate that. Listen, as we're coming to the end now, I want to ask you a question I've asked each of my guests at the end of the podcast, which is, we're in dark times. And they seem to be getting darker. So I'm wondering, what for you, Bill, personally, what gives you hope? How do you sustain yourself through this?
I do have faith in the country. And, I went to one of the No Kings protests right here locally in Northern Virginia. And this is an upper middle class suburb, and people are busy and they work hard and they go to Little League baseball games and take their kids to swim meets when they're not working hard, and they're involved in politics anyway. So the last thing they want to do is go to a protest. It was striking how many people came to the No Kings protest, and in a good-natured way. I mean, they were angry about Trump and upset. That's why they took an hour out of their Saturday to come, a couple hours, and stand and wave signs. But it was a kind of a party or picnic atmosphere almost. And it struck me that kind of American civic spirit isn't dead. It's been distorted on some sides and needs to be revived some. But I guess that's the most recent thing that really left me feeling better about the country.
Yeah. Well, they say activism is a good antidote for anxiety. And certainly seeing that you're not alone can only help. Well, I thank you for those thoughts. I appreciate them. Well, that's it for this episode of This Old Democracy. If you found today's conversation thought-provoking, please share it with a friend, leave us a review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. To learn more about our work and our partners at the Center for Ballot Freedom, visit centerforballotfreedom.org. I'm Micah Sifry, and I'll be back soon with more stories of the people and ideas fighting to renew, repair, and rebuild this old democracy, because it's ours and it's worth saving. Thanks for listening, and stay engaged.